In 1944, the United States Army had a manual for absolutely everything: how to dress, how to march, how to salute, and how to die on schedule. Jake McNiece read that kind of manual, used it to light a cigar, and then spent the war proving the rules were optional if you were reckless enough and capable enough to survive without them. The Army loved obedience. It wanted men who snapped to attention on time, kept their uniforms razor sharp, and never questioned an order, even when the order was stupid. Jake McNiece was the opposite of that dream. He fought military police like it was a sport, lived one bad decision away from a court-martial, and once threatened a staff sergeant over something as small as butter. And somehow, this same man became one of the most decorated paratroopers of the Second World War. 4 combat jumps, Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, France's Legion of Honor. The kind of record you expect from a polished hero in a recruitment poster, not from a walking disciplinary file the Army kept trying to erase. But that was the problem. The Army spent the entire war trying to get rid of Jake McNiece, and the Army spent the entire war needing him to save their operations. He was the man the system couldn't contain and couldn't survive without. James Elbert McNiece, known to everyone as Jake and known to many as McNasty, was born on May 24, 1919, in Maysville, Oklahoma. He was the 9th of 10 children, raised in a family with Irish-American roots and Choctaw heritage. The Great Depression didn't just bruise Oklahoma, it crushed it. In 1931, the McNiece family moved to Ponca City, scraping by in the way people did back then, working, hunting, patching holes, and pretending tomorrow would be easier. Jake learned how to hunt, fish, and trap before he learned algebra. When you're one of 10 kids in the Depression, you either help put food on the table or you don't eat. He took his first full-time job at 10 years old and never really stopped. He worked through high school, worked after graduation, and by the time the world began to tilt toward war, he was already shaped by hard seasons and harder rules. By 1939, Jake was a firefighter for the War Department at the Pine Bluff Arsenal, handling dangerous materials and getting comfortable around explosives, experience that would become very useful very quickly. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Jake was exempt from the draft. Firefighters were considered essential. He could have stayed home. He could have played it safe. That wasn't in him. He didn't want an exemption. He wanted a fight. And not just any fight. He wanted to jump out of perfectly good airplanes, land behind enemy lines, and blow things up while everyone else was still arguing about the plan. On September 1, 1942, Jake enlisted in the United States Army and volunteered for paratrooper duty. The extra money each month didn't hurt, but the real attraction was the mission. He was assigned to a demolition and sabotage section within the 56th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division. The Army thought it had recruited a soldier. What it really got was a force of nature with a short fuse and an even shorter respect for authority. Jake arrived at Camp Toccoa, Georgia, and immediately established 2 truths. First, if there was a task to master, he would master it faster than anyone. Second, he was going to be a nightmare for every officer who had to sign paperwork about him. It took 1 week for the first major incident. Jake was in the chow line. He asked for butter. The staff sergeant running the line said no. Most men would have shrugged, taken the bread dry, and moved on. Jake didn't move on. Jake knocked the staff sergeant out cold over butter. That kind of thing doesn't fit neatly inside an army that runs on discipline, so the chain of command held an emergency meeting. On one hand, privates can't be beating up staff sergeants over condiments. On the other hand, If you're building an airborne force meant to drop behind enemy lines and wreck bridges in the dark, you might quietly admit that an aggressive lunatic has his uses. They let it slide because the war was coming and Jake was too good to lose. A few weeks later, Jake ran the demolition course and didn't just complete it. He set a record faster than anyone in the history of the program. An officer came over to congratulate him. Jake stared him in the eye and said, if that was impressive, the officer should see what Jake could do if he got some butter once in a while. The Army was starting to understand its own mistake. They had found a weapon. They just couldn't figure out how to keep the weapon from turning on them. At that stage of the war, the airborne divisions had a policy. After about a month of training, new recruits were promoted. The logic was grim but practical. These men were heading into the most dangerous job on the battlefield, and many wouldn't come home. The Army wanted them earning a bit more money to send to family before fate caught up. Everyone got the promotion. Jake got it, lost it, got it again, and lost it again. The paperwork couldn't keep up with a man who could be promoted for skill and demoted for behavior in the same breath. Jake didn't care about rank. He didn't care about inspections. He didn't care about playing nice so officers would like him. That forced leadership into an uncomfortable conclusion. Jake was too valuable to throw away, but too toxic to keep around normal soldiers. So the Army tried something creative. They isolated him. They put Jake in his own little unit and made him the acting leader regardless of whatever rank he held that week. Then, every time the Army found another talented troublemaker, another man, too, skilled to punish, but too wild to tolerate, they sent him to Jake. The Dirty Five grew into the Dirty Seven. The Dirty Seven grew into what became known as the Filthy 13. The Army didn't mean to build a legend. It just didn't know what else to do. When the first phase of training ended, Jake and his men were given a pass into town before shipping to Fort Benning for airborne school. They drank, they got loud, they ran into military police, and tension rose the way it always rises when proud men with badges meet drunk men with nothing to lose. One of Jake's men talked back. An MP raised his nightstick. Jake stepped in and told the MP to let it go. Jake later joked the man was so drunk he couldn't hit the floor with his hat if he tried all night. The MP told Jake to mind his business and swung anyway. That was the wrong choice. Jake dropped both MPs, took their pistols, fired every round into a nearby street sign, handed the empty guns back, and calmly suggested they could arrest him now. The next morning, Jake expected punishment. Instead, a commanding officer showed up with an offer. The Japanese were famous for brutal forced marches. The officer wanted to break a distance record by marching men from Tokoa to Fort Benning, an absurd, punishing trek. He believed Jake and his misfits could do it. Jake agreed, and he made a promise that sounded insane. He wouldn't change his socks, and he wouldn't get a blister. Most men would be crippled by that kind of march. Jake did it. His men did it. They broke the record. The Army learned something dangerous. Whatever Jake said he could do, he usually could. The real problem was what he did in between the achievements. By 1944, Jake and the Filthy 13 were stationed in England preparing for the invasion of France. They earned their nickname the Honest Way by refusing to bathe more than once a week and treating hygiene like an optional hobby. They saved water for cooking, poached wildlife from a nearby estate, and left a trail of complaints so expensive the Army ended up billed for damages that sounded unbelievable, until someone remembered whose unit it was. Then Jake's behavior escalated from chaotic to criminal. A few weeks before D-Day, he got drunk in town and missed his ride back to base. Most men would stumble in late and beg forgiveness. Jake found a train and drove it himself. A private in the United States Army, intoxicated, stole a locomotive and navigated it back to his installation. The command didn't know whether to throw him in prison or pin a stripe on him. Around the same time, they discovered he had blown up part of his own barracks. Somehow, the official record leaned toward high spirits instead of felony sabotage. The men above him understood the truth. Jake was the regiment's secret weapon. They just had to keep him out of the stockade long enough to drop him into France. On June 5, 1944, the invasion of Normandy was only hours away. Jake's unit was assigned a mission that sounded like an obituary: jump in with the battalion and secure or destroy bridges over a canal and river line so German reinforcements couldn't reach the beaches at dawn. Everyone expected the jump to be a catastrophe. The drop would happen at night, under fire, in bad weather. Paratroopers would be scattered across miles of enemy territory. Many would die before they even hit the ground. Jake decided his men needed something to focus on besides the idea of dying alone in a French field. He leaned into his Choctaw heritage and made a decision that would burn itself into history. He shaved the men's heads into mohawks. Then he noticed the transport aircraft sitting on the airfield, freshly painted with black and white invasion stripes so Allied gunners wouldn't shoot down their own. The paint was still wet. Jake walked over and scooped it off the fuselage with his hands, smearing it across his face in wary patterns, then painting his men the same way. A photographer was there. The images became iconic. When people picture American paratroopers on D-Day, they picture those faces, mohawks and paint, eyes hard, looking like men who didn't plan on coming back. Jake's logic was simple. If the Germans were already afraid of paratroopers, this would make them look completely insane. His son would later describe it even simpler. Being crazier couldn't hurt. Their officer, Lieutenant Charles Mellon, was one of the few who could work with Jake's unit. Within hours, he would be dead, and Jake, a man the Army could barely control in training, would be the one leading what was left. After midnight on June 6, 1944, the planes crossed into France. The drop was a disaster. Aircraft were scattered by cloud cover and anti-aircraft fire. Men jumped into darkness and vanished. Some parachutes never had time to open. Others landed in flooded fields and drowned. Jake hit the ground alone and started moving toward the objective, like a man who didn't know how to hesitate. The first friendly he found was a paratrooper with a broken back, unable to move, repeating a training phrase like a prayer. Jake couldn't help him. He kept moving, dodging patrols, linking up with scattered Americans, and turning small groups into sudden violence. They stumbled into a German headquarters, opened fire, and killed everyone inside. By the early morning, they reached the canal line, and Jake found the worst truth waiting there. Lieutenant Mellon was dead. Several members of the Filthy 13 were dead, captured, or missing. Of the men Jake had led into Normandy, only a fraction remained. But the mission wasn't finished. The bridges still mattered. The invasion still depended on them. And now, with no officers left in sight and no communication with higher command, Private Jake McNiece was effectively in charge. He gathered whoever he could, his survivors and any, stragglers drifting through the chaos, and pushed toward the bridges near the objective area. No radios, no clear chain of command, just a private leading a handful of exhausted men through enemy territory, because the mission was the only thing that made sense. They reached the bridges and did what they were sent to do. They secured the infrastructure that would slow German response and protect the landing beaches. Then they dug in and held while German forces tested them. probing for weakness, trying to break them. Days passed. Colonel Robert Sink, commanding the regiment, received no word from Jake's sector. Given the catastrophic drop, the casualties, and the silence, Sink made the reasonable assumption. The mission had failed, and the bridges were still usable to the Germans, so he ordered Allied fighters to destroy the bridges. Jake and his men watched American aircraft bomb the very objective they had taken at the cost of their friends. They had completed the impossible. They had survived the nightmare drop and held against counterattacks. And then their own side erased the bridge because command couldn't believe anyone could still be alive to hold it. Jake stayed in position until relief arrived days later. The Filthy 13 had done their job. Headquarters just didn't know it yet. Jake survived Normandy. The unit was rebuilt with replacements, and in September of 1944, they jumped again for Operation Market Garden. The grand plan meant to end the war by Christmas, by seizing bridges across the Netherlands and carving a road into Germany. It didn't end the war. It turned into another grind of chaos, fire, and bad luck. Jake's demolition platoon was tasked with defending key bridges near Eindhoven. They took their targets quickly. Then German bombers arrived. The bombing shredded the city and tore into Jake's platoon, killing and wounding many. The survivors did what demolition men do under pressure. They improvised. They fought through armor and infantry, ripped explosives off bridges, and turned abandoned vehicles into moving cover. Jake found a German truck and drove his men straight into the fight, weaving through artillery, scraping by on instinct and stubbornness. For the rest of the operation, they secured command posts and protected critical communications lines. Jake was promoted to platoon sergeant because, after that performance, denying him would have been delusional. And then, because he was still Jake, he went absent without leave to Paris. When he returned, his leadership gave him an honest warning. The army was cleaning house. Troublemakers were being cut loose. One officer liked Jake, but couldn't protect him forever. There was one escape route: volunteer for Pathfinder school in England. A clean slate. A chance to start over somewhere the paperwork might not be chasing him daily. Jake hesitated. Pathfinder work was supposed to be suicidal, jumping ahead of the main force to mark drop zones. But the war felt like it had to be almost over. Maybe he wouldn't even have to jump again. Then he remembered where the school was located, near Oxford, a university town filled with young women while the young men were away at war. Jake volunteered immediately. Many of the surviving Filthy 13 followed him. They thought they were choosing safety. They were wrong. In December of 1944, the Germans launched their final major offensive through the Ardennes, smashing into American lines and surrounding Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division was trapped inside the town, running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The weather was savage: snow, freezing temperatures, and visibility so poor that air resupply was almost impossible because pilots couldn't see where to drop. Someone proposed a desperate fix: send the Pathfinders in to set up radio beacons and guide the supply aircraft. Jake had finally found a comfortable assignment in England: clean sheets, hot food, no combat. Then an officer told him the Pathfinders were jumping into Bastogne, and the expected casualty rate was horrific. It wasn't just dangerous. It was a mission designed to kill most of the men who attempted it. Jake had volunteered for Pathfinder training, partly to avoid another combat jump. Now the war was dragging him back into the worst moment of it. On December 23, 1944, a small team of Pathfinders jumped into the frozen hell around Bastogne at night. They dropped fast, in darkness, into a pocket surrounded by Germans. The expectation was slaughter. Instead, the Pathfinders landed with minimal losses. The odds were beaten again, because Jake McNiece and men like him were always more dangerous to prediction than to the enemy. They got to work immediately. Jake and his men set up radio beacons on different sides of the town. They knew the Germans could locate the signals and bring artillery down on them, so they did what they always did. They adapted. One team would guide a resupply wave, then pack up and move. The other would guide the next wave from a new position. They kept the signal dancing, never staying still long enough to be erased. The result was massive. Over several days, a handful of men guided wave after wave of transport aircraft, dropping ammunition, food, and medical supplies into a besieged division that was on the edge of collapse. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't look heroic in a movie. It was math and radio discipline and cold hands moving equipment through snow, while knowing any flash of bad luck could bring a shell through your chest. But it saved the division long enough for relief forces to break through. Even then, recognition was a fight. Recommendations for high awards were downgraded. Praise became paperwork. The army that needed Jake in war didn't know what to do with him when the fighting paused long enough for rules to matter again. Most paratroopers made one combat jump in the war. 2 was unusual. 3 was rare. Jake had already done more than that, and he wasn't finished.